by the way, the judge doesn't know what she's talking about. I mean,
by the way, there are a lot of people clamoring for Wendy to actually get back on the air and to have a show again.
When did this judge become Roger Ebert? I mean, I'm serious. Wendy Williams is a hot commodity right now. I can tell you from our Tubi documentary, it attracted a lot of attention. She's done interviews with major outlets.
She steps out into New York Fashion Week like nothing in her life has gone wrong. Perfect hair, polished makeup, designer outfit, cameras flashing, fans cheering. She waves, she smiles, she sits front row like she owns the moment. From the outside, it looks like a comeback story. Like everything is fine. But what happens after the cameras stop rolling is where this story takes a completely different turn. Because that same woman who just looked powerful, present, and fully in control doesn't go back to a hotel suite, doesn't go back to a private penthouse, and doesn't go back to the life most people assume she still has. She goes back to a locked facility floor where she cannot even lock her own door. A place where the rules are not suggestions, they are control. No private freedom over movement. No normal communication. No simple independence that most people take for granted without even thinking about it. And that contrast is what makes everything so disturbing. How can someone look that aware, that sharp, that socially present in one moment, and then be placed in an environment that treats her like she can't make her own basic decisions in the next? That question is exactly where this entire situation begins to crack open. Because the deeper you go into this story, the more contradictions you start to see. Public appearances that don't match private restrictions. Reports that don't fully align with what people witness. And a system that insists it's protection, while the outside world keeps asking if it looks more like control. And then there's the biggest question of all. Who decides when someone is fine enough to sit front row at Fashion Week, but not fine enough to live freely in their own life? Because those two versions of reality don't match. And somewhere between those two worlds, that's where this story really begins. And once you start looking beyond that contrast, the questions only get heavier. Because this isn't just about one night at Fashion Week. It's about what happens when the public version of someone's life and the private version don't seem to match anymore. On one side, you've got a woman appearing in public, attending high-profile events, interacting with celebrities, smiling for cameras, looking composed, even glamorous. But on the other side, there's a completely different environment being described behind closed doors. A locked memory care unit, restricted communication, controlled movement, and oversight that reportedly extends into nearly every part of daily life. And that's where the confusion starts for most people. Because in normal circumstances, those two realities don't exist at the same time. Either someone is unwell enough to require full-time protective care, or they're well enough to appear publicly, socialize, and engage with the world in a way that suggests awareness and independence. But here, both narratives are being presented at once. And that contradiction is exactly what makes this case so heavily discussed. Now, legally speaking, guardianship arrangements like this are not supposed to be punishment. They are designed to protect individuals who have been deemed unable to fully manage their personal, financial, or medical decisions. In theory, it's a safeguard, a legal structure meant to step in when someone is vulnerable. But in practice, the system is far more complicated. Because once a guardianship is established, control shifts. Decisions about money, healthcare, living arrangements, and even communication can move out of the individual's hands and into the hands of a court-appointed guardian. And that's where concerns often begin to surface in high-profile cases. Not necessarily about whether the initial decision was justified, but about how long that level of control should remain in place. Because conditions change, people improve, situations evolve, but legal structures don't always move at the same speed as real life. And when someone continues to appear in public while still remaining under strict oversight, it raises a very uncomfortable question. What standard is actually being used to determine independence? Is it medical evaluation, legal precaution, family concern, or something else entirely? In this case, different narratives keep colliding. Public appearances suggest one version of reality, engagement, awareness, social interaction. But court-related restrictions and facility descriptions suggest another: dependence, supervision, and limited autonomy. And when those two versions don't align, people start filling in the gaps themselves. Some believe it's protection. Others believe it's overreach. And that divide only grows stronger when public figures are involved. Because when someone already has a history in the spotlight, every appearance becomes symbolic. Every photo becomes evidence. Every statement becomes fuel for interpretation. And that's exactly what has happened here. Each time she appears publicly, it challenges the narrative of limitation. But each time reports surface about restrictions, it reinforces the idea of control. And that push and pull creates a story that never fully stabilizes. Now, another important layer in this situation is how guardianship authority actually operates. A court-appointed guardian is typically given legal power to make decisions in the best interest of the individual. That can include medical care, housing arrangements, financial oversight, and even approving certain types of communication or travel. But critics of the system often point out a key issue. Once that level of authority is granted, it can become extremely difficult to reverse, even if the individual appears to show improvement later. Because the burden of proof often shifts. Instead of asking, "Is this arrangement still necessary?" the system sometimes operates on proving that it is no longer necessary beyond doubt. And that is not always easy to establish, especially when medical opinions, legal filings, and personal testimonies don't fully agree. That's where things get legally and ethically complex. Because the system is supposed to balance protection with autonomy. But in real-world cases, that balance is not always clean. And when you add public attention into the equation, everything becomes more intense. Every detail is analyzed. Every inconsistency is amplified. Every appearance is interpreted as either proof of stability or evidence of restriction. And the truth often becomes harder, not easier, to define. What makes this situation even more controversial is how differently it is being interpreted by people watching from the outside. To some, the controlled environment being described sounds like necessary care. To others, it sounds like excessive limitation. And both sides are reacting to the same set of fragmented information. But the core issue remains unchanged. Why does someone who appears publicly functional still remain under such strict legal and physical control? And who is accountable for reviewing whether that control is still appropriate? Because guardianship isn't meant to be permanent by default. It is meant to adjust as circumstances change. But whether that adjustment is happening in real time or being delayed by legal, financial, or institutional factors is where public concern begins to grow. And that brings us back to the central tension of this entire story. The image on the outside looks composed, but the structure on the inside appears tightly controlled. And when those two realities exist side by side, without a clear explanation that fully resolves the contradiction, speculation fills the silence. Not because people want drama, but because the story itself leaves gaps that demand answers. And the real turning point in this entire situation starts when you look at how it was triggered in the first place. Because contrary to what many people assume, guardianship cases like this don't always begin with a dramatic courtroom scene or a family dispute. Sometimes they begin quietly, with a financial concern, a medical report, a single incident that raises enough doubt to open a legal door that is very hard to close later. In this case, that door was reportedly opened after concerns were raised about financial management and vulnerability. And once that process begins, the system doesn't just ask, "Is everything fine right now?" It asks, "Was there enough concern at the time to justify intervention?" That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because guardianship is not built around public perception. It is built around legal thresholds, documents, evaluations, filings, and risk assessments. And once a court accepts that threshold has been met, control can shift quickly. Banks may get involved. Accounts may be frozen. Evaluations may be ordered. And a temporary protective structure can evolve into something far more long-term than originally expected. But here's where things start to become controversial and high-profile. Cases. Because once control is established, it doesn't just depend on one factor anymore. It becomes a network of decisions. Medical opinions, legal filings, financial institutions, court rulings, all layered on top of each other. And when those layers build up over time, reversing them is not as simple as proving someone looks fine in public. The system demands consistency across all domains, not just appearance, not just behavior in one setting, but documented stability across multiple professional evaluations. And that is where many disputes arise. Because public visibility and legal capacity are not always the same thing. Someone can appear coherent in a controlled public setting, yet still be assessed differently under clinical or legal criteria that evaluate broader cognitive or functional patterns. That gap is where interpretation splits. And in this case, that gap has become the center of debate. Now, another major layer that adds complexity is control over communication and access. In guardianship arrangements, restrictions on communication are sometimes justified as protective measures. The idea is to prevent exploitation, manipulation, or financial pressure from outside influences. But critics argue that when those restrictions become too broad, they begin to isolate the individual from normal social contact. And isolation changes everything. Because once someone's communication is filtered or limited, the outside world only receives information through controlled channels. And that creates a situation where perception becomes fragmented. People see public appearances on one hand and hear about restrictions on the other, but rarely get a complete picture that connects both sides clearly. And that lack of clarity fuels speculation. Some people interpret restrictions as necessary structure. Others interpret them as excessive control. But both interpretations are based on incomplete visibility. Now, legally speaking, courts are supposed to review guardianship cases periodically. The intention is not permanence, but oversight. A system that evolves based on new evidence, updated evaluations, and changes in circumstances. However, in practice, these reviews often depend heavily on expert reports and legal arguments presented within the system itself. And that means the outcome is shaped by documentation, not public opinion or media visibility. So even if someone appears publicly capable, that alone may not be enough to change legal status. There has to be formal evidence that meets legal standards. And those standards are often much stricter than what the public expects. That is where frustration begins to build for outside observers. Because they see one version of reality, public appearances, interviews, interactions. But the court sees another, reports, evaluations, and legal filings. And when those two versions don't align, the system defaults to documentation, not perception. Now, there is also the financial structure behind all of this that cannot be ignored. Guardianship is not just about personal care, it also involves estate management. That includes oversight of assets, income, expenses, and legal fees associated with maintaining the arrangement itself. And in high-profile cases, those financial structures can become extremely complex. Because multiple parties may be involved, legal representatives, management professionals, care facilities, and court-appointed guardians, each with defined roles, responsibilities, and compensation structures approved by the court. And while this is designed to ensure accountability, critics argue it also creates a system where multiple stakeholders become financially tied to the continuation of the arrangement, which raises uncomfortable questions about incentives. Not necessarily wrongdoing, but structure. Because when a system becomes financially self-sustaining, any change to that system affects multiple parties at once. And that naturally makes transitions more complicated. Now, it is important to be clear here. Guardianship systems exist for a reason. There are real cases where individuals are genuinely unable to manage their own safety or finances, and legal intervention prevents serious harm. But the controversy begins when cases are not easily categorized. When someone appears functional in some contexts, but restricted in others. When public behavior and legal classification don't fully align. That's when the system moves from clear-cut protection into gray area territory. And gray areas are where debate intensifies, because there is no single standard that satisfies everyone looking in from the outside. Supporters of the system emphasize safety, prevention of exploitation, and structured care. Critics emphasize autonomy, freedom and the risk of overreach. And both sides are reacting to the same fragmented reality. Now, in this specific situation, what keeps the conversation alive is not just the legal structure itself, but the inconsistency people perceive between public visibility and private restriction. Every public appearance raises questions. Every report of limitation raises counter-questions. And every silence in between gets filled with interpretation. And that cycle keeps repeating. Because until there is a fully transparent explanation that connects all these elements, medical, legal, financial, and personal, the narrative will remain divided. Some will see protection. Others will see control. And neither side will fully concede the other's interpretation. Which brings us back to the core tension that defines this entire case. If someone can appear publicly confident, socially engaged, and mentally present, but still remain under strict legal supervision, then the real question is not just about what is happening. It's about how the system defines capacity in the first place. Because once those definitions are set, they don't just shape one case. They shape every decision that follows. And in the next part, we go even deeper into how public perception, media narratives, and celebrity influence collide with legal systems, and why cases like this become larger than just one person. And this is where the story stops being just about one person and starts becoming about how the entire system is perceived. Because once a case reaches this level of public attention, it no longer exists only inside courtrooms or legal filings. It becomes a narrative. A narrative shaped by media coverage, public appearances, social media commentary, and competing interpretations of the same facts. And that's where things get even more complicated. Because in cases like this, the truth is not only what is documented, it is also what people believe they are seeing. And right now, what people are seeing does not fully line up into one clear picture. On one hand, there are reports of strict guardianship conditions, limited autonomy, controlled communication, structured living arrangements, and oversight over major decisions. On the other hand, there are public appearances that suggest awareness, engagement, and a level of functionality that feels inconsistent with that level of restriction. And when those two realities exist side by side, the public naturally starts asking questions. Not necessarily out of conspiracy, but out of confusion. Because humans try to connect patterns. And when patterns don't align, speculation fills the gap. Now, another important layer in this entire situation is how celebrity status affects perception. When an ordinary guardianship case happens, it rarely reaches public discourse. But when the individual involved is a global public figure, every detail becomes magnified. A simple public appearance becomes evidence in one direction. A legal filing becomes evidence in the opposite direction. And suddenly, the case is no longer just legal, it becomes cultural. And cultural cases behave differently. They're influenced by emotion, memory, bias, and public sentiment. Which means the conversation around them often expands far beyond the courtroom record. And that expansion is exactly what we are seeing here. Because people are not just reacting to legal facts, they are reacting to contrast. The contrast between independence and restriction. Between public visibility and private limitation. Between what is seen and what is reported. And that contrast is what keeps this story alive. Now, it is also important to understand how difficult it is to overturn or significantly modify a guardianship once it is in place. Legally, the burden of proof is not just about showing improvement. It often requires demonstrating sustained, documented capacity to manage personal and financial affairs independently. And that typically involves multiple evaluations, expert testimony, and court approval. Which means even if someone appears fine in public, that alone may not meet the threshold required for legal change. That is why these cases often move slowly, sometimes for years, because the system is designed to avoid premature reversal. But critics argue that this caution can sometimes create inertia, a situation where restrictions remain in place longer than necessary because the process to remove them is so demanding. And that is where tension builds. Because from the outside, people see motion without resolution. Appearances without structural change. and they begin to question whether the system is responding to reality or simply maintaining itself. Now, there is another layer that often gets overlooked in discussions like this, and that is the emotional reality of being under guardianship. Regardless of legal justification, losing autonomy over basic decisions, where to live, how to communicate, how to manage daily life, has a psychological impact. It changes how a person experiences identity, independence, and control. And when that experience is combined with public visibility, the contrast becomes even sharper, because the world still sees the public version of the individual, while the private version exists under a completely different structure. That duality creates tension not just in perception, but in interpretation of intent. Is the system protecting someone who cannot fully care for themselves? Or is it restricting someone who still retains significant independence? And without full access to medical and legal records, the public can only interpret fragments. And fragments are always incomplete, which leads to another important reality. In high-profile cases, information is often filtered through multiple layers before it reaches the public. Lawyers speak through filings. Representatives speak through statements. Media outlets interpret through reporting. And social media amplifies through reaction. By the time the information reaches the average viewer, it has already passed through several lenses, each one shaping tone, emphasis, and context. And that is why two people can look at the same situation and walk away with completely different conclusions. Because they are not seeing the same unfiltered source, they are seeing interpretations of it. Now, stepping back from all the speculation, one fact remains consistent. The system is still active. The legal structure is still in place. And ongoing reviews are still determining future outcomes, which means the story is not finished. It is still unfolding. And that is why every new development, whether it is a public appearance, a court date, or a medical evaluation, gets immediate attention. Because each update has the potential to shift the narrative slightly. But until there is a decisive legal change, the core contradiction remains unresolved. Public visibility suggests one thing, legal structure suggests another, and neither has fully overridden the other. Which brings everything back to the central question that has followed this entire case from the beginning. How do you define capacity in a world where perception and documentation don't always agree? Because that definition determines everything. Who gets autonomy? Who gets oversight? Who gets restored independence? And who remains under protection? And until that definition is universally clear and consistently applied, cases like this will continue to generate debate, confusion, and speculation. So as the public continues watching, and as new evaluations and hearings approach, one thing is certain: this story is not just about what has already happened. It is about what the system decides next, and whether those decisions finally align with what people believe they are seeing, or continue to challenge it. Because in the end, the most powerful question in this entire situation is not just about her condition. It's about control, interpretation, and trust in the system that decides both. And that's where everything stands for now. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think this is a case of necessary protection through guardianship, or does it look more like control disguised as care? Because the same facts are being seen in two completely different ways, and the truth depends on how you interpret what's really happening behind the scenes. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, where we go beyond headlines and actually analyze what's really going on in these celebrity legal stories, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because this story is still developing, and the next update could change everything.